She was tied to a chair in a burning basement with locked doors on both sides when Elena finally understood. The man she'd trusted to heal her had been poisoning her all along. But that moment of clarity came far too late, with flames climbing the walls and smoke filling her lungs. And she was absolutely certain she would die here in Marcus's world, just as he'd always promised she would. 13 hours earlier, the day had begun like any other failed attempt at normalcy. Elena sat on the edge of a dove-gray velvet sofa, her spine rigid, not touching the backrest. She held a white ceramic mug of chamomile tea. The steam had stopped rising long ago. The apartment was quiet, except for the rain tapping against the glass pane. A dimmable floor lamp cast warm, amber light across the living room. The kind of light that was supposed to make you feel safe. The kind of light that hadn't worked in 3 years. Rain continued its assault on the windows. She watched the droplets race down the glass, each one finding its own path downward, and she tried to make her shoulders relax. Dr. Aris said her tension was a choice. He said mindfulness could rewire her nervous system. He said that if she just stopped feeding the fear, it would starve. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Her head snapped toward the sound immediately. The mug hit the glass coffee table with a sharp clink. Her right hand flew to her throat, covering the small silver locket that hung there. It was a habit she'd developed. Touching the locket when the walls started closing in, as if the cold metal could ground her to something real. She reached for her phone on the cushion. The screen lit up, showing 14 missed calls from unknown number. She swiped them away, her thumb trembling over the delete all button. The calls had started 3 weeks ago. They never left voicemails. They just called and called and called. The apartment suddenly felt too small. Elena stood and walked to the window. She looked down at the street below. A black sedan was parked illegally by a hydrant. Its headlights flickered once. Just once. But she saw it. She drew the heavy navy blue curtains shut with a violent tug. The fabric rings screeched across the metal rod. She leaned her forehead against the curtain, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "I am safe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He is not here. I am safe." The words were supposed to work. They were the grounding technique. She'd practiced them with Dr. Aris twice a week for 3 years. He said repetition rewires the brain. He said that speaking truth aloud was the first step toward believing it. But the words had never sounded like truth. The diner near her apartment was open until 9. Elena locked her apartment and walked down to the parking garage under the building. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting everything in sickly yellow. She walked toward her red Mini Cooper, keys clutched between her fingers like brass knuckles. Another technique from Dr. Aris. Always be ready to fight. Always assume the worst. Always stay vigilant. She never questioned why a healer would teach a patient to live in a state of combat readiness. As she reached for the door handle, a tall man in a leather jacket stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. "Elena?" His voice was gravelly, low. "We need to talk about Marcus." "No." The word came out as a scream. Elena swung her heavy leather tote bag at the man's head. The brass buckle caught him across the cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. He staggered back, hand reaching for his face. "Stop! I'm not him. I'm trying to help," he shouted. But Elena was already moving. He lunged, grabbing her wrists. They wrestled against the side of the Mini Cooper. The car alarm went off, a piercing, rhythmic honking that echoed through the garage. Elena kicked the man's shin with her pointed boot. He grunted and released his grip. She dove into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. The man stood outside the glass, palms pressed against it, his face contorted with frustration or desperation. Elena couldn't tell which, and she didn't wait to find out. She put the car in reverse. Tires screeched. She looked in the rearview mirror as she sped away. A yellow envelope was tucked under her windshield wiper, fluttering in the wind. She drove for 20 minutes before she felt safe enough to pull over under a bright street lamp. She reached out the window and grabbed the yellow envelope. It was soaked with rain and felt heavy. She tore the top open with shaking hands. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. She pulled it out slowly. It showed Elena herself, sleeping in her bed, taken from the perspective of her bedroom doorway. The angle made her stomach turn. The invasiveness of it. The violation of being photographed without knowing, in the one place she was supposed to be safe. She flipped the photo over, handwritten on the back in red ink. "You forgot to lock the kitchen window, just like you forgot us." The handwriting was identical to her own gratitude journal notes. The swirling G in forgot. The exact slant of her U's. Elena searched the envelope further and found a small silver USB drive. A neon pink sticky note was attached. "The truth about your therapist, Dr. Aris." Her vision blurred. The diner clock across the street showed 8:55. The garage, the envelope, the photograph, the USB drive. It all collapsed into a single, terrible realization. The stranger wasn't Marcus. But someone was following Marcus. Someone knew about Marcus. Someone knew about Dr. Aris. She slammed her palm against the steering wheel. The horn blared across the empty parking lot. "Nowhere is safe," she said, her voice flat and defeated. Elena drove to a motel off the main highway. She paid cash. The room smelled like bleach and old cigarettes. She locked the chain on the door and sat on the bed with the laptop she'd brought from her apartment. She plugged in the silver USB drive. The folder opened on the screen. It contained photos of Elena's therapy sessions, taken through a hidden camera mounted somewhere in Dr. Aris's office. She scrolled through them slowly. There she was, sitting in the leather chair, crying. There she was, gripping the armrests, talking about her panic attacks. There she was, completely vulnerable and completely watched. One photo made her stop. It showed Dr. Aris handing a thick envelope of cash to Marcus in a parking lot. The date stamp read, "Last Tuesday, 14 was." Her appointment with Dr. Aris that day had run until 3:30 p.m. She'd sat in his office, telling him about her nightmares while he waited downstairs for her ex-boyfriend to pick up his payment. She clicked a link labeled Insurance Payouts. The spreadsheet showed billing statements. High-risk premium claims, treatments never provided, session notes fabricated. Her insurance company had paid thousands for sessions that were monitored and weaponized against her. Marcus's bank account was listed as payee. "They turned my pain into a business," Elena said to the empty room. The clock on the nightstand showed 11:15 p.m. A calendar alert popped up on the laptop screen. Final settlement, so 6 Zaxar a.m. An automated transfer. Her entire savings account. A forged power of attorney. 6 hours and 45 minutes until she had nothing. Elena looked at her reflection in the motel mirror. She wiped the blood and dirt from her face with a coarse white washcloth. She turned her head side to side, studying her own eyes. They were still wide, still frightened. But something was shifting in them. Something cold was moving into the frightened space. He wasn't healing her. He was keeping her triggered to maintain the cash flow. She found the GPS location data embedded in the files on the USB drive. There was an address. A cabin in the woods, 40 minutes outside the city. Active GPS signal detected at 1:17 a.m. Elena looked at the clock. 1:23 a.m. She left the motel without checking out. The red Mini Cooper carried her through dark streets toward the forest. She parked the car half a mile from the cabin, hiding it under brush, and proceeded on foot. The woods were cold and dark. She crept through the trees, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The moon filtered through the skeletal branches, casting everything in shades of gray. The old cabin came into view. A light flickered in the basement window. Elena crouched down, moving closer. Through the basement window, she could see Marcus sitting at a folding card table, counting stacks of hundreds. He was laughing. Dr. Aris stood next to him, checking his watch. They looked like businessmen, like this was just another transaction, another exchange of money for a service rendered. The service was Elena's suffering. She heard a sound behind her, a sharp intake of breath, and then a heavy hand clamped over her mouth. A taser crackled against her side. Her body went limp. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Leo's face looming over her, his expression utterly professional, as if he was simply doing his job. She woke up tied to a wooden chair in the center of the basement. Her wrists were bound with thick yellow nylon rope. The rope cut into her skin. A bare light bulb swung slightly overhead, casting moving shadows across the concrete floor. Marcus stood in front of her, spinning her silver locket around his finger. "I told you that you couldn't survive without me," he said, his voice dripping with false intimacy. "Look at you, right back in my hands." Dr. Aris leaned in close to Elena. He held a syringe filled with a clear liquid. He sighed with performative pity, touching her cheek with his cold fingers. "The trauma was just too much for her," he said, his voice perfectly soothing, perfectly clinical. "A tragic overdose. The records will show she was suicidal for months." But Elena had already hidden the letter opener in her sleeve during the struggle in the woods. As they talked, standing over her like she was already dead, she began sawing through the yellow rope behind her back. She kept her face blank, feigning unconsciousness. The rope fibers snapped one by one. She could hear Marcus laughing, telling Dr. Aris about all the other women they had in the system. Aris was explaining how the insurance fraud worked better when the victims had pre-existing trauma. They were so focused on their plan that neither of them noticed her hands slowly coming free. As Marcus leaned in to slap her awake, Elena's hands broke the final strands of rope. She drove the letter opener into Marcus's shoulder with all the force she had. He bellowed in pain, falling back and knocking over the table of money. Cash scattered across the concrete floor like an avalanche. Leo lunged at her. Elena grabbed the wooden chair she'd been tied to and swung it with both hands. It shattered against Leo's ribs. He hit the concrete floor hard and stayed down, gasping for air. Dr. Aris tried to inject her with the syringe. Elena grabbed his wrist, twisting it until the bone snapped with a sickening crunch. The syringe fell. She kicked it across the floor. She then delivered a headbutt to Aris's nose. Blood sprayed from his face onto his white shirt. Marcus recovered faster than she'd anticipated. He tackled Elena from behind, his hands around her throat, an old Persian rug partially covering something on the floor. She yanked it back. Underneath was a small metal hatch. She opened it to find a reinforced safe lid. No, not a locked safe. Not now. Not with flames climbing the walls and smoke filling her lungs and the door locked from the outside. She collapsed against the safe hatch, her lungs burning. She saw her silver locket on the floor where Marcus had dropped it. She reached for it one last time. It was warm to the touch. She looked at the engraving. The date they met, 10/24/12. The safe dial was right there, glowing in the firelight. Elena spun it, 10, 24, 12. The hatch clicked. The bolts released with a heavy clunk. It opened. A root cellar tunnel stretched down into darkness. Elena crawled through it, the narrow dirt walls pressing against her sides. Roots brushed against her face. She was running out of air, her lungs screaming for oxygen, when finally the tunnel opened onto forest floor. She emerged into cold night air, gasping. She crawled only 30 yards from the cabin, but it was enough. Behind her, the cabin was now a towering inferno, flames shooting into the black sky. She could see Marcus walking toward his car, carrying a duffel bag of the cash he'd managed to save. He hadn't seen her yet. He was fumbling with his keys, his shoulder bleeding heavily from the letter opener wound. Elena picked up a heavy fallen branch. She didn't hide. She walked into the light of the fire, moving into the clearing where he could see her. Marcus turned. His eyes widened as if seeing a ghost. "I'm not a score, Marcus," Elena said, her voice steady and thunderous. "And I'm not yours." Marcus dropped the bag and lunged, but his injury slowed him. Elena sidestepped and swung the branch. It hit his legs, taking him down. He fell hard, gasping, and Elena stood over him as police cruisers burst into the clearing, their sirens deafening, their flashlights pinning them both to the ground. The interview room at the police station was cold and institutional. Elena sat at a metal table, a blue paper blanket over her shoulders. She handed over her second phone, the one the stranger had actually given her in the garage before she'd panicked and fled. It contained the mirrored cloud backup of everything. "This data," the detective said quietly, looking at the screen. "It links Aris to 3 other states. You've stopped him from doing this to anyone else." Elena watched on a small monitor as Dr. Aris was led down the hall in handcuffs, his nose bandaged. He looked small and pathetic without his clinical office environment, without the careful staging of the leather chairs and the books about healing. He was just a man, just a predator in professional clothing. The detective showed her a photo. "The man from the garage, the one you fought. His name is Thomas. He's an undercover investigator. His sister was a victim of Project Mirror 6 years ago. She was in the same group as you. When he found out about the operation, he went undercover as the clinic's receptionist." Elena looked at the photograph. The man from the parking garage. The man she'd hit with her tote bag. The man who'd been trying to save her the entire time. She signed her official statement. Her signature was firm. Elena Vance. She was still Elena Vance. She was still whole. She left the silver locket on the table in the evidence bag labeled Case Juror 8829. She didn't need it anymore. It wasn't her anchor to Marcus. It was just a locket. Elena walked out of the station as the sun was rising. Golden light painted the buildings pink and gold. She took a deep breath, the first one in years that didn't feel tight or constrained. The air went all the way down. A week later, Elena sat on a park bench. She was reading a book titled Unseen Wounds. She had a small, real smile on her face. Around her, the park was alive with people. Children played in a grassy area. The wind moved through the leaves with a sound like whispered promises. Her phone dinged. A message from a private support group for Project Mirror survivors. "We're all safe. Thank you." She was scrolling through messages of gratitude when a man in a casual flannel shirt stopped in front of the bench. It was Thomas. He nodded politely and handed her a small, plain white envelope. "Thought you'd want the real ones," he said. Elena opened the envelope. Inside was a medical certificate, lab results, the word negative next to psychosis and positive next to lead arsenic trace. She had never been crazy. They had poisoned her with low-dose toxins to keep her confused and dependent. She had always been sane. Elena looked up at the sky. She tore the lab report into small pieces and threw them into the air. The white pieces floated like butterflies, catching the sunlight as they fell. She stood up from the bench and walked away into the golden afternoon light, her footsteps steady and sure.